The house was supposed to be empty, but Coda was staring at the staircase like someone upstairs had just whispered Claire's name. 3 hours earlier, Claire Donovan had rolled a blue suitcase down the front steps, locked the door behind her, and driven away beneath a pale October sky, leaving every neighbor on Hawthorne Lane with the same harmless impression. The former Marine was finally taking a vacation. But Claire never reached the airport. Now, just after 10 p.m., she stood inside her own dark living room with her keys still cold in her hand, listening to the old house settle around her. Coda entered beside her, 6 years old, black and tan, broad through the chest, his amber eyes moving through the darkness with quiet precision. Claire expected him to sniff the rug, check the kitchen, maybe wander toward his water bowl. He did none of those things. His paws stopped on the hardwood. His ears rose. His body became perfectly still. Claire knew that stillness. During her years in the Marines, she had learned that danger rarely announced itself with noise. Sometimes it was the silence that changed first. Coda lifted his nose. Once. Twice. Then his gaze settled on the staircase. Claire followed it toward the second-floor landing, where moonlight spilled through a narrow window and painted a silver rectangle across the wall. Nothing moved. No footsteps. No shadow. No voice. Still, Coda would not look away. "What is it, boy?" Claire whispered. His answer came as a low growl, so quiet she felt it before she fully heard it. Claire's fingers tightened around her keys. She had spent weeks telling herself there was an explanation for everything. The coffee mug turned the wrong way in the cabinet. The basement door left open an inch. Her father's photograph shifted slightly on the mantel. Small things. Ridiculous things. Things that sounded even smaller when spoken aloud. Nothing had been stolen. No window had been broken. Yet every time Claire convinced herself she was imagining it, Coda would stop outside her late father's study and stare at the closed door as though the house remembered something she did not. That was why the vacation existed. Not for rest. Not for beaches or room service or a few quiet days away. It was a test. Claire had made sure the suitcase was seen. She had mentioned the trip casually. She had driven 12 miles toward the interstate, waited until darkness settled over the neighborhood, then returned through the wooded path behind her property with Coda at her side. She wanted to prove herself wrong. She wanted to walk into an untouched house and feel foolish. Coda took one slow step toward the stairs, then another. His nails clicked softly against the wood. Claire held still. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Wind brushed dry leaves across the porch. Somewhere upstairs, the old timber gave a faint creak. Coda froze. Claire stopped breathing. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then came another sound. Small. Clean. Deliberate. Click. Not the house settling. Not the wind. Coda turned his head toward Claire, and in his amber eyes she saw the answer she had spent 3 weeks trying not to believe. They were not alone. 3 weeks earlier, Claire had still believed the first strange thing was nothing. It was a Tuesday morning, cool and bright, with sunlight slipping through the maple trees along Hawthorne Lane and laying gold across the kitchen floor. Claire came downstairs at 6:15, as she had nearly every morning since leaving the Marines, and found Coda sitting beside the counter. He was not waiting for breakfast. He was staring at a white ceramic coffee mug inside the glass cabinet. Claire opened the door and frowned. The mug faced outward, its faded Marine Corps emblem visible through the glass. She always stored it with the emblem turned toward the wall. It had belonged to her father, and small habits around his things had become rituals after he died. Claire touched the handle. "I must have moved it." Coda looked at her, then toward the hallway. That evening, she found the basement door open barely an inch. The old brass latch sometimes failed during humid summers, but October had been dry for weeks. Claire closed it, tested the knob twice, and went upstairs. 2 nights later, Coda woke her at 2:43 in the morning. He did not bark. He stood beside the bedroom door, ears forward, listening. Claire sat up and listened with him. The house answered with ordinary sounds. The furnace breathing through the vents, branches brushing the siding, an old clock ticking downstairs. Nothing more. "Come on, boy." Coda followed her into the hallway, but instead of heading downstairs, he stopped outside her father's study. The door was closed. Claire rested her hand on the knob and felt an old ache return. She had kept the room almost exactly as her father left it. His books still lined the shelves. His reading glasses rested beside a green desk lamp. A framed photograph showed Claire at 27, standing beside him after returning home from deployment, both smiling into hard Virginia sunlight. She opened the door. Coda entered first. He crossed the rug slowly, sniffed near the desk, then stopped beside the bookcase against the far wall. His nose moved along the baseboard. Claire watched him for nearly a minute. There is nothing there. Coda sat down. He did not agree. By the following week, Claire noticed the photograph on the mantel had shifted half an inch to the left. Then a kitchen chair was slightly farther from the table than she remembered leaving it. Nothing valuable disappeared. The doors remained locked. The windows showed no damage. She began photographing rooms before leaving for errands, embarrassed by the habit even as she continued doing it. When she compared the pictures at night, most showed nothing unusual. One Thursday afternoon, the study door appeared wider than it had been that morning. Claire stared at the photograph on her phone, then at the doorway. A difference of perhaps 2 inches. Too small to prove anything. Large enough to keep her awake. Coda walked past her and returned to the bookcase. He lowered his nose to the same strip of baseboard and inhaled slowly. Then he looked up at Claire. She had trusted instincts before. Her own had carried her through years when overlooking a detail could change everything. But this was home. Home was supposed to be the place where vigilance ended. Claire crouched beside Coda and ran her fingers through the thick fur behind his ears. You feel it too, do you not? His eyes stayed fixed on the wall. The next morning, Claire pulled an empty suitcase from the closet. The suitcase looked almost cheerful sitting open on Claire's bed, bright blue against the gray quilt, and for a moment, she hated it for making the lie seem ordinary. She packed carefully anyway. 2 sweaters, jeans, running shoes, a paperback she had been meaning to finish, toiletries in the front pocket. Nothing about the bag suggested that she had no intention of spending a single night away from Hawthorne Lane. Coda watched from the doorway, his head tilted slightly, as though he understood that Claire was performing for someone neither of them could see. By noon, she had mentioned the trip to exactly 3 people. Mrs. Bennet next door heard about it while collecting her mail. Claire's cousin Rachel heard during a brief phone call. And Michael Reeves, her father's oldest friend, heard when he stopped by with a cardboard box of old photographs he said he had found in his garage. Michael was 61, silver-haired, soft-spoken, and familiar enough to enter through the kitchen without ceremony when Claire was home. After her father died, Michael had repaired a leaking gutter, brought groceries during a winter storm, and checked the house whenever Claire traveled. He still had an emergency key. Claire had never thought twice about it. A vacation sounds overdue, Michael said, setting the photographs on the table. Where are you headed? North Carolina coast. Few days near the water. Claire kept her voice casual. Michael smiled. Your dad would approve. At the mention of her father, Coda lifted his head from beside the refrigerator. His amber eyes settled on Michael for several seconds before drifting toward the hallway. Claire noticed. She noticed everything now. At 4:30 that afternoon, she carried the suitcase down the front steps. Mrs. Bennet waved from across the hedge. Claire waved back, loaded the bag into her sport utility vehicle, and opened the rear door for Coda. She drove away beneath a sky fading from blue to copper, taking the familiar road east until Hawthorne Lane disappeared behind the trees. 12 miles later, she pulled into a quiet parking area near a closed farm stand and switched off the engine. Coda sat upright behind her. Claire looked at the clock. 5:12. Now we wait. Darkness came slowly. Cars passed on the county road, their headlights sliding across the windshield and vanishing. At 8:40, Claire started the engine again. She did not drive home directly. She parked nearly half a mile from her property beside an old access trail and continued on foot with Coda. The night smelled of damp leaves and distant chimney smoke. Their steps disappeared beneath the whisper of wind moving through bare branches. By the time Claire reached the rear edge of her property, every window in the house was dark. She stood behind the trees and studied the place where she had slept safely for years. Nothing moved. No unfamiliar vehicle waited nearby. No light appeared behind the curtains. For several minutes, Claire almost laughed at herself. Maybe she had built a mystery out of loose hinges, old floors, and grief. Maybe she would enter, find everything untouched, and finally sleep. She unlocked the back door at exactly 10:07. Coda crossed the threshold first. Claire followed. The house smelled familiar, but Coda stopped before she could close the door. His ears rose. His nose lifted toward the darkness. Then, without looking toward the staircase, he turned slowly toward the hallway leading to her father's study. Coda did not rush toward the study. That frightened Claire more than a bark would have. He moved slowly down the hallway, placing each paw against the hardwood with unusual care, his ears forward and his nose testing the air. Claire followed several feet behind him. The darkness inside the house felt different now, heavier somehow, as though every familiar object had learned to keep a secret. The grandfather clock near the dining room marked 10:08 with a soft mechanical click. Coda stopped. Claire stopped with him. For a few seconds, the only sound was the furnace pushing warm air through the vents. Then Coda continued. He passed the staircase without looking up. That caught Claire's attention. Minutes earlier, he had reacted to something above them, but whatever held him now was closer. He reached her father's study and stood before the closed door. His nose touched the narrow space beneath it. One breath, another. Then he looked back at Claire. "Okay," she whispered. "Show me." Claire turned the knob. The door opened with the same faint creak she had heard 1,000 times. Moonlight from the side window stretched across the rug, touching the desk, the green lamp, and the shelves her father had built by hand nearly 20 years earlier. Everything appeared untouched. Claire reached for the wall switch, then stopped. Coda was listening, his head angled slightly toward the bookcase. Claire heard nothing at first. She stepped inside. The room carried the familiar scent of cedar, old paper, and the faint trace of her father's pipe tobacco that somehow remained years after he had stopped smoking. Coda crossed the rug and went directly to the far wall. Not the desk, not the window, the bookcase, the same place he had inspected night after night. He lowered his nose to the baseboard and followed it from left to right. Then he stopped near the bottom shelf. A low growl rolled through his chest. Claire crouched beside him. "What are you smelling?" Coda pressed his nose toward the wall. Claire placed her palm against the painted wood beside the shelf. "Cool." She moved her hand 6 inches to the right. "Still cool." Another 6 inches. "Warm." Claire froze. The furnace vent was on the opposite side of the room. There should have been no source of warmth behind that wall. She leaned closer and noticed something else. Dust lined the floor beneath the bookcase, except for one narrow section where the hardwood looked recently disturbed. Claire ran a fingertip across it. Clean. Too clean. Her pulse quickened, but her training pulled her thoughts into order. Look first. Decide second. She examined the shelf. Near the bottom corner, one brass screw showed bright metal where the others had darkened with age. Someone had turned it recently. Coda suddenly lifted his head. His ears snapped toward the hallway. Claire remained crouched, listening. Nothing. Then came the sound again. Click. This time it was not upstairs. It came from somewhere behind the wall. Coda stepped between Claire and the bookcase, his body rigid but controlled. A thin current of air touched Claire's fingers. She moved her hand along the wooden trim until she found a seam no wider than a thread. Cold air slipped through it, carrying a scent she could not identify. Claire leaned closer. The panel behind her father's bookcase was not part of the wall. It was a door, and sometime after she had driven away that afternoon, someone had opened it. Claire did not touch the hidden panel immediately. She stayed crouched beside Coda, studying the thin seam while the cold draft moved across her fingertips. The Marine in her wanted facts before conclusions. The daughter in her wanted to pull the wall apart and demand an answer from a house that had belonged to her family for 23 years. Coda made the decision simpler. He lowered his nose to the clean strip of hardwood, inhaled, then moved toward the edge of the bookcase. Claire followed his gaze and found a shallow notch beneath the lowest shelf. She pressed it gently. Nothing happened. She tried again, this time lifting slightly as she pushed. A soft wooden click answered from inside the wall. The panel moved half an inch. Claire waited. No footsteps came from the hallway. No voice called from the other side. She eased the panel wider. Behind it was not a room, but a narrow passage between the study wall and an old brick chimney, barely 3 feet across. Dust floated through the beam of her phone light. Exposed wooden studs rose toward the ceiling. Electrical wires ran along one side. The space smelled of dry timber, insulation, and something newer. Claire felt Coda move beside her. He sniffed once and became still. "Stay close," she whispered. She expected to find someone hiding there. Instead, the passage was empty. For one brief second, relief washed through her so quickly she almost laughed. Then her light reached the floor. Dust covered most of the narrow passage, but near the opening were two clean impressions shaped by shoe soles. Beside them sat a plastic water bottle with a few drops remaining inside. Claire touched the bottle. It was not warm, but it was not cold either. Someone had been there recently. Coda stepped forward and sniffed the wooden frame. His nose traveled downward until he found something caught against a rough nail. A small piece of dark blue fabric. Claire pulled it free. Cotton. Soft. Ordinary. She stared at it, trying to understand why the color felt familiar. Then memory arrived. Michael Reeves had worn a dark blue work shirt that afternoon when he brought the photographs. One cuff had been frayed near the wrist. Claire's stomach tightened. No, she murmured. Coda sniffed the fabric and looked toward the passage. Claire remembered Michael repairing the gutter after her father died. Michael checking the furnace during the January freeze. Michael standing in this very study, telling stories about fishing trips with her father before Claire was born. He had a key because Claire trusted him. Trust, she had learned long ago, was rarely destroyed by one enormous moment. Sometimes it changed because of one thread caught on one nail. Her phone vibrated suddenly in her hand. Claire nearly dropped it. A message glowed on the screen. Michael, hope you made it safely. Enjoy the coast. Claire read the words twice. Coda remained focused on the darkness beyond the panel. Then he moved deeper into the narrow space and stopped beside a wooden support beam. Something metallic lay beneath it, almost hidden by dust. Claire reached down and picked it up. A small brass key. She recognized the faded red mark painted across its head. Her father used to keep that key on a hook inside his desk. After his funeral, Claire had searched everywhere for it. She had never found it. Until tonight. The brass key felt heavier than it should have. Claire stood inside the narrow passage with Coda beside her, turning the small piece of metal beneath the pale light of her phone. The red mark was unmistakable. Her father had painted it years ago because, as he liked to say, a man should never waste 10 minutes guessing which key opened what. Claire remembered the hook inside his desk drawer. She remembered seeing the key there every Christmas, every birthday, every Sunday afternoon when she came home from base. Then her father died, and the key disappeared. Claire stepped back into the study and opened the desk. The empty hook was still there. Coda emerged behind her and sat near the bookcase, watching the hallway. Claire looked again at Michael's message. Hope you made it safely. Enjoy the coast. She typed a reply with deliberate calm. Made it. Long drive, but worth it. Coda is already asleep. She pressed send. Less than a minute later, 3 dots appeared. Then Michael replied. Good. You both needed the break. Claire stared at the words. He had accepted the lie too quickly. Still, suspicion was not proof. By morning, Claire had moved herself and Coda to a small motel 6 miles away, leaving the house exactly as she found it. At 9:20, she called Michael. He answered on the 3rd ring. How is the ocean? He asked warmly. Cold, Claire said. Coda hates the wind. Michael chuckled. That dog always did prefer a roof. Claire let silence sit between them for a moment. I found something before I left. Dad's old red-marked key. The line went quiet. Only for a second. Did you? Michael finally said. Where was it? Claire watched Coda lying near the motel window. In the study. Another pause. Probably fell behind the desk years ago, Michael said. His voice remained gentle, almost fatherly. Your dad misplaced everything except his opinions. Claire smiled without feeling it. Do you remember what it opened? No idea. The answer came faster this time. Claire thanked him and ended the call. An hour later, Michael appeared at the motel. Claire had not told him where she was staying. She saw his gray pickup cross the parking lot and felt something inside her go cold. Michael stepped out carrying a paper bag and 2 cups of coffee. Rachel told me your reservation fell through. He explained when Claire opened the door. Thought you might need breakfast. It was plausible. Rachel knew the motel because Claire had called her that morning and asked her to keep the change of plans private. Michael smiled. Coda did not growl. He simply rose and moved between them. Michael stopped. Still suspicious of me, old boy? He reached into the paper bag. Coda remained motionless. Then Michael noticed the brass key on the table behind Claire. His smile changed. Barely. His eyes moved from the key to Claire and back again. That thing, he said softly. I have not seen it since your father kept the lockbox behind the study wall. Claire said nothing. Michael's face lost its color. He seemed to hear his own words a second too late. Coda took one quiet step forward, not threatening, only certain. Claire looked at the man who had known her family for half her life. I never told you there was a wall. Michael did not answer. The motel room seemed to shrink around the silence, filled only by the soft hum of the heater and the distant sound of tires passing on the county road. Claire watched his face carefully. For years, Michael Reeves had been part of the architecture of her family, as familiar as the porch light or her father's old truck in the driveway. Now one careless sentence had moved him somewhere else. "Claire," he said at last, setting the coffee cups on the dresser, "your father showed me that space years ago." Coda remained between them, calm and motionless. Claire looked down at the brass key. "Then why did you say you had no idea what this opened?" Michael rubbed a hand across his silver hair. "Because some things belong to your father. I did not think they should become your burden." It was the kind of answer that almost worked because it sounded like kindness. Claire had heard people hide behind kindness before. "Go home, Michael." His eyes lifted to hers. "You are making this bigger than it is. Then going home should be easy." Michael hesitated, glanced once toward Coda, and quietly left. Claire waited until his pickup disappeared before locking the door. She did not return to Hawthorne Lane until late afternoon. The October sun was already dropping behind the trees when she and Coda entered through the back door. The study waited exactly as they had left it. Claire switched on her father's green desk lamp and opened the hidden panel. Coda went first, nose low. The passage extended farther than Claire had realized, bending around the brick chimney before ending at a shallow recess behind the shelves. There, beneath a layer of insulation, stood a small steel lockbox. A faded red dot marked the keyhole. Claire stared at it. Her father had not misplaced the key. He had hidden both pieces separately. She inserted the brass key. The lock turned with a dry click. Inside were no stacks of cash, no jewelry, nothing that explained years of secrecy at first glance. There was a worn envelope, a small flash drive, several bank statements, a photograph, and an old set of marine dog tags wrapped in a handkerchief. Claire recognized the tags before she touched them. They belonged to her father. He had served long before she did, and when Claire enlisted, he had given her those tags for luck. After her first deployment, she returned them. He had laughed and told her she had earned her own history. Claire lifted the photograph next. Her father stood outside a veterans charity office beside Michael and 3 other men. Everyone was smiling. On the back, in her father's handwriting, were 5 words: "Follow where the donations went." Claire unfolded the bank statements. The same charity name appeared again and again, along with transfers made over several years to accounts she did not recognize. The amounts were not enormous individually. $5,000, $8,000, $12,000. But together they told a different story. Money intended for military families had been quietly redirected elsewhere. At the bottom of the box lay the envelope. Claire opened it carefully. Inside was a letter addressed to her, written in her father's uneven hand. He explained that he had discovered financial records that did not match the charity's public reports. He had copied what he could and hidden it until he could determine whom to trust. One sentence made Claire stop breathing for a moment. "Michael knows I found the discrepancies." Coda suddenly lifted his head. Claire looked toward him. He was staring at the photograph in her hand, or perhaps at the scent clinging to it. She remembered Michael's visits after the funeral, his offers to organize paperwork, his questions about whether her father had left documents behind. At the time, they had sounded compassionate. Now they sounded like searching. Claire picked up the flash drive and held it beneath the green lamp. A small strip of masking tape covered one side. Her father had written a date on it. The date was 3 days before he died. Claire closed her fingers around it, and the room seemed to become very quiet. Michael had not been entering her house because he wanted something valuable. He had been looking for something dangerous to a secret he had carried for years. Coda moved beside her and pressed his shoulder gently against her leg. Claire rested one hand on his back. Then she noticed something beneath the lockbox, almost hidden in the dust. A fresh scrape ran across the wooden floor toward the wall. Someone had already tried to move the box, and they had planned to come back. Claire did not leave the evidence in the house. Before sunset, she photographed every document, copied the flash drive onto 2 secure devices, and placed the originals in a bank safe deposit box under her name. Then she made one phone call to a former Marine she trusted, now working with federal investigators on financial crimes involving veterans organizations. She did not accuse Michael. She gave him facts: the transfers, the hidden records, The unexplained visits. The investigator listened and asked Claire to do one thing above all else. Do not confront him alone. So Claire did something Michael would understand. She left again. The following afternoon, the blue suitcase returned to the sport utility vehicle. Mrs. Bennet saw Claire loading it. Rachel received a message saying the reservation problem had been fixed. Michael received nothing. That silence was deliberate. By 8:30 that night, Claire's house was dark. Her vehicle was gone. But Claire and Coda were inside, waiting in a small room near the rear hallway while two investigators remained out of sight nearby. The evidence was already safe. Nobody needed heroics. They needed the truth to walk through the door on its own. At 9:17, Coda raised his head. Claire heard nothing. 30 seconds later, his ears turned toward the kitchen. Then came a sound so ordinary it almost hurt. A key sliding into the back door. The lock turned. Michael entered quietly. He carried a flashlight, but he did not switch on the kitchen lights. He moved through the house like someone who knew where the floor creaked and where it did not. Claire watched from the darkness as he passed the hallway and entered her father's study. Coda remained beside her, silent. Michael crossed directly to the bookcase. No searching, no hesitation. He knew. He opened the hidden panel and disappeared inside. Several seconds passed. Then Claire heard the steel lockbox shift. Michael returned holding it beneath one arm. He took 3 steps into the study before Coda walked from the hallway. The German shepherd did not bark. He simply stood beneath the doorway, amber eyes fixed on Michael, and released one low growl. Michael stopped. Claire stepped into the soft light spilling from the window. Put it down, Michael. His shoulders sank. For the first time, he looked older than 61. Claire, you do not understand. Then help me understand. Michael looked at the lockbox, then at Coda. Your father discovered money being redirected. I told myself it was temporary. Administrative mistakes. Loans that would be replaced. Then there were more transfers, more excuses. By the time he found out, I had spent years protecting people who should never have been protected. Claire felt no triumph. Only sadness. And you came here to erase what he kept. Michael lowered his eyes. I was afraid. Claire looked toward Coda, the dog who had noticed the wrong scent, the wrong silence, the wrong rhythm inside a familiar home. Behind Claire, another voice spoke calmly. Mr. Reeves, set the box on the desk. Michael looked toward the hallway and finally understood. There would be no argument tonight, no secret carried back into darkness. He placed the lockbox beneath the green lamp. Coda stopped growling. Claire rested her hand against his shoulder. For weeks, she had wondered what her dog sensed inside the walls. Now she knew. Coda had never been afraid of an empty house. He had been listening to a lie. By morning, Hawthorne Lane looked exactly as it always had. A thin October mist rested over the lawns. Yellow leaves gathered along the curb, and somewhere beyond the neighboring houses a school bus sighed to a stop before moving on. Claire stood at the kitchen window with a warm mug between her hands while Coda drank from his bowl behind her. Nothing outside suggested that the night before had changed anything. But inside the house, the silence was different. It no longer felt occupied by something unseen. The investigators had taken statements, documented the hidden passage, and collected what they needed before leaving shortly after midnight. The records Claire had secured would be reviewed carefully, and the families connected to the missing charity funds would finally have someone following the trail her father had refused to forget. Claire did not know how long that process would take. She did not need to know yet. For the first time in weeks, there was no mystery waiting behind the walls. Later that afternoon, she returned to her father's study. Sunlight filled the room instead of moonlight, warming the old books and turning the dust above his desk into tiny drifting sparks. The hidden panel stood open. Claire looked at it for a long moment, then closed it gently. She placed her father's dog tags inside a small wooden box on his desk, beside the photograph of them together after her deployment. Her fingers rested on the worn metal. You could have told me, she whispered, and a faint smile touched her face. Maybe he had, in the only way he still could, through records saved instead of destroyed, through a key hidden where patience would eventually find it, through a truth that had waited quietly for someone willing to listen. Coda entered the study and sat beside Claire. She rubbed the thick fur beneath his collar. And you, she said softly. You knew something was wrong before I did. Coda looked up at her, then gave a tired sigh and lowered himself onto the rug. That evening, Claire cooked dinner, washed the dishes, and turned off the downstairs lights one by one. No photographs had moved. No door stood open. No strange scent lingered near the study. At 10:46, she walked through the hallway and stopped beneath the staircase. 3 weeks earlier, Koda would have been standing there with his ears raised, listening to something Claire could not hear. Tonight, he was stretched across the rug near the fireplace, paws loose, breathing slow and deep. Wind moved through the maple trees outside. A branch brushed lightly against the window. Claire turned toward the sound out of habit. Koda did not move. She watched him for a moment, and something inside her finally softened. Home had never been wood, locks, photographs, or walls. Home was the place where trust could close its eyes. Claire switched off the final lamp. In the darkness, Koda slept without guarding the hallway. And for the first time since the strange little signs began, Claire walked upstairs without looking back.